All right, everybody. Let's settle back into our seats so that we can get ready to listen to our next speaker. Thank you, thank you. Hopefully this has all been helpful for y'all. Lots of different learning nuggets throughout the day. It's been so great hearing from all the different speakers and different perspectives. Our next speaker is Dr. Tim Radak. He is an academic coordinator for the Public Health PhD program at Walden University, where he has taught public health courses since 2010. He previously served as assistant professor of nutrition and dietetic internship director at Appalachian. Is it Appalachian or Appalachian? Isn't there a debate? Okay, I'll just say Appalachian. Okay, Appalachian State University, Senior Research Program Manager for the Cancer Prevention Institute of California, and Director of Nutrition for Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. He has been credentialed as a registered dietitian since 2000 and earned his doctorate in public health nutrition at Loma Linda University. Tim has authored or co-authored 15 articles and abstracts in peer-reviewed scientific journals, written several textbook chapters, and contributed to and participated in television, radio, and newsprint media as an expert on various public health nutrition topics. His research interests include the relationship between plant-based diets and reduced risk of chronic diseases, epidemiology of chronic diseases, essential fatty acid requirements and metabolism, behavioral strategies for lifestyle modification, body composition, food insecurity, and nutritional assessment methodologies. So it sounds like he's in the right place. Please welcome Dr. Radak as he presents Nutrition and Nutrient Review and Planning Guide, Whole Food, Plant-Based, or Vegan Diets.
Again, thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to spend a little bit of the afternoon talking to you about the history of vegetarian diets going back to the 1950s, covering what the research says in terms of health benefits, how we've changed from adequacy to optimal diets, and then understanding what are the caveats that keep people who pursue a plant-based diet from reaching optimal status. So I'm going to try to convince you that this diet, when followed properly, has an incredible amount of power to it. And I've put together some slides of about 30 years worth of research. So let's just dive into it. No disclosures. So I put together, as my first slide, this research done by Dr. Joanne Sabate, who was the chair of the nutrition department at Loma Linda University. And this came out over 20 years ago, but is really, really relevant to this day. And not a lot of scientists cover this article, but I think it's really, really key to understanding where we were, where we came from, where we went, and then hopefully where we're going. So what this research attempted to do is, in 3 slides, provide some pictographs of where the research was and what it was covering in terms of vegetarian diets and omnivorous diets. So if we go back to like the 1960s and early 70s, when you look at the solid line there, that's the vegetarian diet. You can see the bulk of it was in the adequate zone, but there was also some risks of deficiencies. And there's a number of reasons for that. If you look back in nutrition science in the 20th century, it was all about deficiencies. We were covering beriberi, pellagra, folate deficiencies, all types of deficiencies. So the whole scientific community was kind of based on that. So when vegetarianism kind of came in, it followed that same kind of format. And then also, there were challenges that were debated in terms of, take the continent of Africa, for example, countries that have a completely different food culture, and recommending vegetarian diets for those that may not be getting enough calories at all. Could that lead to some potential deficiencies? So that's why you saw that left of that bar curve the way it is. We then shifted from optimal nutrition to health status, adequate nutrition to optimal nutrition. And what I mean by that is when you look at the first slide, We had adequacy, which is we're just preventing nutritional deficiencies. We're not thinking about longevity. We're not thinking about risk reduction. We're just looking at, do these diets actually prevent deficiencies? But then in the 70s and early 80s, we started to shift. We had some good epidemiological research. And now we were looking at things in terms of what's optimal. So that includes things like longevity and lower morbidities, obviously less mortality. And so now you see on the right side of the bell curve, there's also a little bit of risk of excess. So anybody have any ideas what that means? Risk of excess for those that follow vegetarian or meat-based omnivorous diets? Any? Too much fat, too many calories. Maybe those calories are not nutrient dense. And that's exactly right. What about the left curve in terms of risk of deficiency? It actually was bigger than before. Well, let's go to the final slide. So this brings us up to roughly around the year 2000 or so. And when you look at vegetarian diets, what the research was producing, the bulk of the research is now fully in the optimal zone. The risk of excess is very little. However, for omnivorous diets, the risk of excess is much larger. But the risk of deficiency is minimized, but it's enlarged for omnivorous diets. Why might an omnivorous diet have some risks of deficiency? Fiber, absolutely fiber, lack of vegetables. What about phytochemicals and phytonutrients? So those diets are at much greater of a risk for deficiency of those items. And as we'll see in some slides, I'm going to try to make a case that those should be classified just like vitamins and minerals. We have enough solid research now to suggest that those are literally essential. So fast forwarding to now, for the last 30 years of research, I've tried to summarize, if you follow these diets and you participate in a research study, these are the types of risk reductions you're likely to see. I'm not going to go over all of them because there's simply too many. I have slides and slides and slides of what these diets can do when properly followed. Someone mentioned fiber, and certainly those who follow vegan diets, I'll just use vegan as the common reference term, um, tend to enjoy much greater fiber intakes. And the average fiber intake for omnivores is somewhere between 10 to 15 grams, but vegans are clocking in at 30, 40, sometimes even greater than that. And we'll learn why that's so important, not just for what happens in your microbiome, but when those metabolites cross over into the bloodstream and confer additional benefits and risk reduction. Again, continuing on, those that follow these diets tend to enjoy some of the highest gut equal production, whether you're drinking green tea or having soybean products like tempeh. Your gut tends to produce the isoflavone metabolite known as equal, and there's some good solid relationships between reducing cancer from that. Less hospitalization, medical costs, and medication usage. How many of our talks today have mentioned the healthcare system and the burden of chronic diseases? Well, those that follow vegan, vegetarian diets enjoy a much less burden, so to speak. So those are studies that either are following prospectively or longitudinally, but what about actually putting this diet to test? Doing an intervention, using it for therapeutic reasons. And so we now have sufficient enough trials to actually show that whether it's coronary heart disease, most notably from Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, was able to take patients that had some severe artery clogging and put them on a vegan diet and a few other lifestyle changes and watch those arteries, the narrowing, be reduced. Phenomenal photos. But so many other diseases too. Look at the autoimmune diseases like lupus and Sjogren's syndrome. Obesity, obviously, metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is tied to so much inflammation. We see so many other chronic diseases that are impacted by that. So this diet can be used for a lot of therapeutic uses. some more here. Reducing advanced glycation end products, for one, reducing inflammatory markers. There's now enough research for, I just put two examples here for two systematic reviews and meta-analysis looking at the inflammatory profiles of various diets. And that's important because inflammation is tied to just about every chronic disease. I mean, look at the list in the first paragraph of how much inflammation is tied to diseases. So one example of those who follow vegan diets and have high fiber intake, that fiber intake is going to end up being converted into short chain fatty acids, butyrate, acetate, propionate, which are going to stimulate the colonization of your healthy bacteria. They're going to stabilize your epithelium, which is your layer between your gut and the rest of your body. And even specialized microbes in your gut are going to break down phytochemicals like polyphenols, anthocyanins, phenolics, and flavins, and those individually confer anti-inflammatory properties. So it's not just the fiber, it's things like your blackberries and your raspberries, those seeds that are full of phenolic compounds. Those are going to break down into your colon and actually create anti-inflammation properties. There's an interesting study that I wanted to share with you that compiled 6,500 studies and tried to point out what the top items were that reduced inflammation in the diet. So the top, and this is 6,500 studies. So the top were fiber, turmeric, flavones, isoflavones. You can see the list. Most of these are comprised of plant-based diets. On the other side, pro-inflammation, saturated fat, total fat intake, trans fats, becoming less of a concern, but still relevant, total energy and cholesterol. So if we looked at the top items, that's a really nice chart. And this is why when you see studies like this that say worse inflammatory profile in omnivores rather than in vegetarians, it's because of what's happening in the microbiota. So study after study has looked at the microbiome in terms of vegan diets with a positive effect, whereas animal foods really create an environment of kind of a setup for metabolic disorders. And this is why I consider a well-planned vegan diet to be an anti-inflammatory diet. So that's what the research says. What actually composes a well-planned whole foods vegan diet? The first sentence in the green there pretty much sums it up. It's minimally processed foods that are nutrient dense. Those are fruits, vegetables, beans, legumes, grains, nuts, and seeds with a focus on minimally processed. Variety and diversity of all of those items will help ensure adequacy to make sure that those that are following these diets meet vitamin, mineral, macronutrient requirements. There are a few sticking points to make sure you have covered when following any diet plan, but particularly this one, is we need to have a reliable source of vitamin B12 and preferably cyacobalin. This is a more stable, better efficacy in terms of assimilation. And one note is if you are taking B12 as a vitamin multivitamin supplement, that tends to be less well absorbed. So if you're using vitamin B12 from a multivitamin standpoint, it's better to select something else. What's my preference? Well, I drink a non-dairy milk every day that's fortified with vitamin B12. Also, nutritional yeast is another convenient way to ensure that your levels are at where they need to. The other thing is iodine. So iodine comes from the ocean. It gets evaporated into the atmosphere and comes down in various proportions into the ground. And so whatever vegetable or fruit you're consuming is largely dependent on how much iodine made its way into that soil. This is why, the US several decades ago said we're going to choose something that's very commonly used, which is a salt shaker, fortify it with iodine to make sure everybody gets a good supply of iodine. Obviously, the salt shaker is not the best choice. Why? Salt, sodium. What's a good connection with blood pressure, right? So we want to ensure a good source of iodine. Sea vegetables are absolutely phenomenal source, and you actually have to be careful not to overdo it because just a little bit will more than adequately supply your iodine needs. How many of us eat sea vegetables or recommend those to our patients? A few. Okay. Vitamin D, mainly sourced is through UV radiation, sunlight, but that depends on your latitude, your age, your skin type and color. Most of us spend most of our lives around four walls, right? Most of our workday is not outside, it's inside. And when we go outside, we're usually covered. Um, in some ways, that's very good that we're not running around naked, but we do want to get exposure to vitamin D. And we had some discussion earlier today about that in terms of how much do you need and how much exposure. And what I always like to suggest is, optimally, not going out in the middle of the day and going towards the end of the day or the beginning of the day where the angle of the sun's a little bit softer, if you will. And 15 minutes will do it. And if you're wearing sunscreen, that's not an issue either. That's one of the biggest misconceptions is that people think that that's inhibiting vitamin D synthesis, and it's actually not. So you can apply that sunscreen and you're still going to synthesize vitamin D. There's also another alternative too from mushrooms. So you can take any kind of supermarket mushroom, whether that's a white button or cremini or maitake, shiitake, what have you, chop it up into quarters or halves, put it on a cookie pan and let it sit out in the sun for half an hour. You'll get almost 5 days worth of vitamin D, and it didn't cost you a penny. You just have to look out for bees and flies and things like that that might want to latch onto that. And you could put something over it like a screen if you want to, but a very easy source of vitamin D. And it's particularly useful to make up shortfalls in winter because you can dry those mushrooms, put them in a mason jar, store them in the refrigerator or where your spices are. And the reduction in vitamin D is only like 10 or 15%. So it's still a very viable source of vitamin D to make up the shortfalls. And vegans do have lower rates of vitamin D in winter, depending on which latitude you're at. So, that could be a concern because parathyroid hormone will get secreted. That could leach some calcium from your bones. So it's important to make sure that your vitamin D levels are adequate. And then lastly, essential fatty acids. This is probably the most controversial topic in plant-based nutrition. There's everybody under the sun recommending an algae supplement or not recommending not to take omega-6 fatty acids, but it's actually fairly easy and straightforward. We just want to make sure that our omega-3 intakes are adequate, and they already are. A nice meta-analysis of vegans looked at 2.69 grams of omega-3 fatty acids per day on average, and about 2 grams of that was coming from alpha linolenic. So we're meeting our intakes. However, vegans also tend to have a little bit too much of omega-6 fatty acids. So in terms of ramping down a little bit of omega-6, that may be the only key to worry about. In terms of taking a DHA supplement, there just isn't enough evidence to suggest that that has any beneficial impact. And time again, I see the research framing the conversion rate of omega-3s as being inefficient or somehow improper, but the body knows exactly what it's doing. And I think it's actually very, very eloquently designed because it's just not omega-3s that have that slower pathway. It's also omega-6s. Nobody really talks about that. Both of these pathways only produce anywhere from 1 to 10% of your end stage product. And that's actually probably exactly where it's supposed to be. The end result of these are powerful compounds, or some are anti-inflammatory, some are very pro-inflammatory, and you want to have a nice balance. Too much of one is going to offset, the other. So if you're in the military doesn't want you to be taking fish oil supplements. Why? Increase bleeding time. If you're going to be on the operating table, what's one of the things they're going to mention that you not take? Things that could actually promote, or delay increase bleeding time, essentially. So there's lots of reasons why that delicate balance needs to be the way it is. But I developed this slide here to show you how easy it is to get your omega-3 fatty acid intakes. We only need about 1.1 or 1.6 grams per day, depending on which gender you are. And you can easily meet that without adding any walnuts, chia, flax, algae, any significant oil from fortified foods. Nature has done a wonderful job of spreading omega-3 fatty acids all over the plant kingdom. So when I go out to the garden and I munch on a few raspberries, I think to myself, yeah, it tastes good, but if I crunch those seeds, I'm getting a source of omega-3 fatty acids from a berry. So I just want to spend a moment or two on variety because it's so incredibly important. Michael Greger from Nutrition Facts came out with this video. It's my top favorite video of the thousands that he's produced. And it has to do with what happens to cruciferous vegetables that get broken down into the colon. So there's a special epithelial lymphocyte, which are immune cells that are right on the epithelium. And remember, your epithelium is your one layer. It's one sheet between the gut and the rest of your body. It's very thin because it needs to. It's transferring a lot of helpful properties and hopefully not unhealthy ones. But there's these lymphocytes which help stabilize that epithelial layer. It helps grow additional cells on the epithelium. And there's only one key that unlocks these lymphocytes. And researchers spent decades trying to figure out what is that key that can unlock this mechanism to stimulate immune response and literally have your immune foot soldiers do the work for you. And they discovered that it's a antioxidant in cruciferous vegetables and only cruciferous vegetables. So that's your broccoli, your Brussels sprouts, your kale, your collards. So this alone makes a case for essentiality if you want to maximize your immune function. We've got to have these cruciferous vegetables. Should we have a whole section of our dietary guidelines for cruciferous vegetables? I think we should, just based on this research alone. So if you're interested in watching that video, everybody gets a set of all the slides here. It's a real good one to watch. This slide is what I like to present to patients just to show them just how beautiful and colorful a whole foods plant-based diet can become. This is from the New and Enlightened Kind diet folks in Florida. And I just love using this to illustrate this can be a very positive and colorful experience. So we know what looks like a properly followed whole foods vegan-based diet. Well, what does a poor one look like? And what gets us in the way from achieving optimal vegan nutrition? Well, not following the first few slides is certainly one reason, but also B12 deficiency. There's still quite a lot of B12 deficiency in vegetarians and vegans, and that simply should not be the case. This should be of a magnitude far less than what we're seeing. And, there's a lot of ramifications for that. So if we want optimal nutrition, we need to ensure that all of these bases are covered. We also see some vitamin D insufficiency, which I mentioned, and some ways to make sure that you're covered during winter. And then, as so many other presenters have mentioned this afternoon, everything's been veganized. There isn't a product out there that hasn't been veganized. And vegetarian magazines love to profile the latest conversion, right? So if you look at the recipes, I'd probably say 75% of them are almost qualifying as a processed food. And I'm not demonizing that. I mean, we're in a society that's very animal centric. If we're intending to try to move folks away from that and gravitate towards plant-based, there's a case to be made for transitional products. But some of these can be really addictive in nature. And so meeting a patient where they're at, what they had before in terms of previous dietary intake is critical. And it's not as easy as just going to the grocery store and saying, oh, this is vegan, I'll grab it. Take a look at coconut oil, for example. This is a margarine that's available and also proudly says that it's vegan, but it has more saturated fat than butter or margarine. So you have to read those labels and be careful in doing so. The other thing I want to mention is about meeting a patient where they are. We've heard that actually over several talks today, and certainly where that previous diet is incredibly important. But so are social determinants of health. You know, we are not all on an equal playing field when it comes to food availability, health food availability. Um, whether we're talking about the built environment or food deserts. I mean, there is a playing field that is not equal. And there's also still mistrust. I mean, what we did with the Tuskegee experiments in the 1930s all the way to the 1970s is horrific. And we'll be paying back that scenario in terms of regaining the trust of the African American community still for decades to come. So this is an important factor to consider when someone's following this diet. There's a lot of competition out there. We are absolutely bombarded with billboards. It's very hard to find a billboard that has broccoli on it, you know, or any other vegetable. So there's so much soaking into our brains, whether we're driving to work, whether we're going to the grocery store. I literally estimate that if you go to the supermarket, 70% of what's being sold in the supermarket is unhealthy. And so you're navigating kind of a minefield, or you're helping your patients to navigate a minefield that's really set up not to be successful. And one of the biggest items is processed foods, but even more is ultra processed foods. So a study in the US suggested that literally half of daily calories were contributed by ultra processed foods. You can see in that table to the right there a lot of examples. This is staggering. And what we're now discovering is literally every chronic disease, the microbiome, all these things are tied into the overconsumption of ultra processed foods. Where do you think the United States stands in terms of consumption of ultra processed foods? We're number one in the good way or the bad way? In the bad way, right? Let's see. Well, you're right. We lead the globe, and not just in consumption, but in manufacturing. So, you know, you'd be mistaking yourself if you told your patients, you know, food companies have as their primary outcome your health at stake. That's just not true. You know, it's not. And so, you know, these products in terms of ultra processed foods are engineered, designed to be addictive. They're laden with fat, sugar, salt. They contain emulsifiers and stabilizers that have been shown to be deleterious to your gut. So we need to reduce this as much as anything else. Recently, researchers at University of Michigan looked at the criteria for addiction, whether that was for alcohol, tobacco, or other addictive substances, and found that ultra-processed foods literally meet the criteria to be addictive in the way that your brain responds to it. This is very serious, and the fact that it's as consumed as it is means this is, you know, priority health number one. And what's the easiest and cheapest foods to get at the supermarket? It's these, you know? So it's a real challenge. So again, in terms of helping patients to be optimal in their nutrition when they transfer to a plant-based diet, those are the caveats that we want to consider and discuss with patients to make sure they understand this is not just eliminating meat and dairy from your diet. There's much more coming along for the road. There's lots of other things here. Some of these I've mentioned already. A vegan diet is not necessarily a whole foods plant-based diet. And then there's a lot of other external factors that are cultural, social, even inflation. You know, we saw a study being talked about this afternoon about the perceived expense of fruits and vegetables in those following vegetarian diets. And as a nutritionist, it's very interesting to see how industry markets to registered dietitian nutritionists. And one of our hallmark trade magazines had an advertisement here from the pork folks trying to convince dietitians, even slighting vegetarians, by telling us that processed deli meats, processed just simply means convenient and or prepared, and that poor lifestyle choices based on misinformation like this is what makes it difficult for registered dietitians to be able to communicate objective nutrition information. We're constantly bombarded by this. So if physicians are bombarded by pharmaceutical rep companies coming into your office, this is what the dietitians have to wrestle with. So even within the field itself, there's additional challenges. I talked a little bit about variety and diversity. The USDA does a US household intake study from time to time. The blue areas are what the average household is consuming. The yellow is what are supposed to be recommended. And as you can probably intuitively confer with a standard American diet, we have too much of what we're not supposed to have and not enough of what we're supposed to have. Someone said this earlier today, literally 1 out of 10 Americans meets their vegetable intake, and fruit intake is right along the same. So very, very minimal amounts. How much time did we spend on the importance of fruits and vegetables, right? We're not packing it in. So quantity is important, but also quality is important. Literally half of the vegetable intake in the US comes from 2 things, potatoes or tomatoes. And most of that is in the form of pizza marinara sauce or chips or fried potatoes. So severely lacking in diversity. What do you think that has on the effect of the diversity of the microbiome? Your healthy bacteria in your gut, how diverse are they if you're only feeding them a limited amount of food products? Right, limited. Yeah, limited. And diversity is very important. What are the top things? Not just potatoes and tomatoes for vegetables, but what about fruit? Apples and oranges and bananas, the top majority of what people consume. When you go into a produce market or area of the supermarket, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of fruits and vegetables, but consumers typically stick to 5 or 7 fruits or vegetables that they're familiar with, and they buy them over and over and over again throughout the year, with a few exceptions of seasonality, some things in particular like summer and things like that. But the diversity is sorely lacking. The last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of helping patients reach optimal nutrition is to understand where they're at in terms of the stages of readiness. So I like to use Petroska's stages of change as a great model because if a patient is still in pre-contemplation, they're interested in plant-based diets, but they're really not ready yet to make that switch, and maybe they're told they need to make that switch, it doesn't matter how much education, pamphlets, booklets, or whatever you can throw at that patient, they're not likely to succeed. So we have to understand where a patient is psychologically as well. And that's becoming increasingly challenging. Just a few tidbits about COVID-19. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as you might expect, most populations ate worse, right? We also didn't exercise as much. There are a few exceptions. In the UK, they seem to be more threatened by getting viruses from animal products. So they actually decreased their animal intake, interestingly, and were more willing to try meat alternatives. And they stuck with that, by the way. There is some good news in terms of plant-based diets in COVID-19. Several studies now have come out to support that moderate to severe COVID-19 is reduced. The risk of getting it is reduced in terms of plant-based diets compared to omnivores. Why might following this diet actually result in having less COVID-19 if you contract it? Increased immunity, better microbiome, right? Who's most obese in this population, obesity wise? Omnivores, right? Vegetarians and vegans tend to have much less body weight. So that also is one of the largest risk factors. When they looked at COVID morbidity, the vast majority of mortality from COVID-19 was due to those that had excess body weight. The last thing I want to mention is also the other decisions or reasons why individuals choose to follow plant-based vegan diets. And if this is a kind of a nice study that came out looking at those that made that switch for health reasons or those that made that switch for ethical animal rights related reasons. And while they all basically did fairly well in terms of vegetable and fruit intake, there were differences. And the ethical fruit consumers were much less compared to those that chose for health reasons. So when you sit down and talk to a patient and say, well, what is it? What's driving you to want to make this switch? Understanding things like this are really important. And I actually think they're often overlooked. So all to say, the published research, could it be a lot stronger? Could the associations and risk reductions be greater if individuals that were being researched and following vegan or plant-based diets were doing it in an optimal way with minimal processed foods, a variety of whole foods? Just consider for a moment how much greater the research could be. We now have some good screeners because a lot of times when we look at vegetarian research, we're not even cataloging fruits and vegetables in a way that differentiates between processed foods, processed vegetables, processed fruits, things like that. So ACLM just came out with a nice screener. Some folks in Italy just came out with a nice vegan screener. So we can expect to see better, more strengthened research come out focusing on vegetarian vegan diets because we're going to understand what the quality of that diet is. And here's a couple examples of comparing a healthy vegetarian diet to an unhealthy vegetarian diet. And you can see the differences in terms of cardiovascular risk and mortality, as well as type 2 diabetes. So we're just now really starting to accumulate this type of difference, and it's very important. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about some few guidelines. If you take a look at the MyPlate, what percentage, the federal dietary recommendation schematic of the MyPlate, what percentage of that is already plant-based? A lot, right? I mean, half the plate is already fruits and vegetables. The other quarter is grains, switch out dairy, switch out protein source, and you've got something that's already recognizable and easier to work with rather than developing something brand new. But if you're looking for an alternative, the UK uh, food group came out with a plant-based eat well guide that's available and downloadable, and it's excellent because it covers all the bases on one basically colorful schematic. We often hear people don't know what to do with vegetables. I don't know how to cook them, this and that. So one of my top recommendations as a dietitian is how to use seasonings. Grow some herbs if you're able to at your place of residence, or learn to experiment with vinegar, liquid aminos, things like this. This can dramatically increase your consumption of vegetables when you have some other flavor to go along with it. I'm a big fan of Dr. McDougall. I interned with him in California, and he has an excellent list of recipes for no oil salad dressings, things that use a lot of fresh lemon and citrus and things like that to add a lot of flavor to your vegetables. We're not talking about just salads, but vegetables. This stuff can be used directly on vegetables. There's some other plant-based resources I'm not going to go over, but there's quite a few out there now that are always available on the internet. So I provided a few of them there. ACLM has some fantastic free downloadable, very colorful guidelines for clinicians to use. In 2022, the Family Physician's Introduction to Lifestyle Medicine was published. This is phenomenal. I mean, it is chock full of information. And this is just one slide that you can pick out and share with your patients or yourself. I mean, I learned so much from just that one edition itself. It's just loaded with info. There's a lot of organizations out there that are helping us to go in the right direction. All these organizations directly support plant-based diets. More and more are joining the list every day. I covered that already. And my last article I just wanted to mention is out of Germany, actually. So this is a physician in Germany that's trying to make a point that because we have accumulated enough research on vegan diets in terms of their health aspects, but also the planetary aspects, that we're now navigating an ethical quandary to require advocating these diets to our patients, not just because for patient outcomes, but for environmental outcomes. That's a huge change that needs to come very quickly. If that's not good enough, ChatGPT has indicated that we will all be vegan by 2075. So you can breathe a nice sigh of relief here for those that are able to make it there, or if you're not, at least you know in the future we're all going to be vegan because the Gen Z and millennials are going to drive that for us. So interesting times to come. So thank you so much for your attention, and would be welcome to answer any questions you had.
We have a couple online already.
Sure.
First one is, do eggs cause inflammation like dairy and meat do? And I would piggyback on that to say, could you say anything you'd like to about choline? That's
Choline,
been
yeah.
in the spotlight.
Yeah, sure. So, gut microbes will produce things like TMAO from foods that contain choline, and animal products are a very rich, robust source of that. So that's meat and dairy and eggs as well. So these things will cross over into our metabolism and increase our risk for cardiovascular diseases. So yeah, very relevant, I think. Other.
The next question is, please address the popularity of the carnivore diets. All the health benefits of the plant-based diet is also being claimed by carnivore diet followers who claim studies back them up as well.
I think we need about an hour to unpack that one, but suffice to say, there is a new diet, and we talked about this. Some presenters mentioned this earlier today, but there's constantly a debate, whether it's a keto diet, whether it's the paleo diet. And if you look back in history, for the bulk of our existence, we actually were plant-based. We were foragers. We were not meat eaters. That was a very, very small segment of our overall growth. And there's plenty of anthropology studies to support that. So when I see these diets, I mean, look at the keto diet. Why do they call that the wedding dress diet? Because you do lose weight quickly, right? But the bulk of that weight is water. And we now have enough research that says for those that are able to stay on that diet, and I challenge you to find anybody that's on a keto diet for more than a year. Why? There's so much constipation, digestive upset. Your body hates this, it doesn't want that. So the indicators in terms of risks for kidney problems and cardiovascular disease are now starting to demonstrate that those who follow diets like carnivore diets simply are doing themselves a disfavor down the road. You may get some quick results in the immediate time frame, but the downstream of that is going to be filled with extra health risks. And the same goes with those that follow some, raw foods in terms of eating raw seafood or raw meat. There's a good reason why we ended up gravitating towards cooking and using fire. So, in fact, one of the reasons why I became a vegetarian in the 1980s was because of trichinosis. I read an article in the U.S. Army in the canteen where they were cooking, or they thought they were cooking with pork, but they opened up that pork and there were worms all over it because it had trichinosis. And I was like, I don't know if I want to eat that. So that's how it starts. Another question. Sorry, turned everybody off for dinner now. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, hello? Oh, are there any dietary recommendations or even reversal of things like hypothyroidism?
Hypothyroidism. Hyper or hypo? Hypo. I'm not aware. Does anybody else here have any research that suggests hypothyroidism issues? I know a little bit about gout. Iodine is important. And we do have studies, showing that iodine levels are not as high as they should be in the plant-based community. So
Thyroidism, we're seeing so much more hypothyroidism in people on meds. I
yeah,
was curious is it diet related and is it reversible then if it is diet related?
super good question, but fortunately it's not happening in the plant-based research community. So we're not seeing any increase in thyroid disorders, which is good. However, you can go on the internet, go to Weston Price, go to whomever, you'll find lots of propaganda that says that we can't eat soy, or, we need to consume salmon for our omegas. There's plenty of this stuff, but it's really unfounded. So, yes.
Okay, question online. Some of my patients want to know about using condiments such as ranch, ketchup, and other sauces with their salad. Your opinion, please. And I would like to piggyback that also. There had been a question that what we didn't have time for earlier about does fermenting certain dairy make it a little bit better? Two separate questions.
So
but
two
kind of
separate
related.
questions. So first about condiments, ask anybody to eat a hamburger without any condiments on it and ask them how tasty it is. Bacon is probably an exception to that. But, condiments play a useful role in driving flavor of food products. So if you're going to have a veggie burger, do you want to have a condiment on it? Sure. For a salad, I don't know if I prefer ketchup or mustard, in my salad greens, but I will use balsamic vinegar. I'll sprinkle nutritional yeast. I'm an absolute fan of granulated garlic. I mean, the studies that come out on garlic are phenomenal. I mean, what they do to reduce sticky platelet adhesion, reducing cholesterol. I mean, granulated garlic is the ultimate go-to in our kitchen. So sprinkle that on your salads or your vegetables. I say you're going to get a win-win. Fermented question. What was that question about fermented foods? Is it
Did
good?
fermenting dairy make it a little bit better, or is it still the same risk?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with, if we're talking about things like yogurt products. A lot of these fermented products, if we're talking about dairy in particular, will have strains that actually will compete with commensal bacteria in your gut. So it's very hard for them to establish. So if you look at the research of those that are, and I know the yogurt industry will not like this, but you're not really having much of an effect. So, when we're talking about probiotics and prebiotics, it's very important to differentiate what the gut actually needs, because if you're throwing probiotics in there, like fermented foods from dairy, they're going to be very challenged to be able to survive and colonize in an environment. So the other piece of this is fermented non-dairy products. And whether we're talking about things like miso or tempeh, kimchi, there's plenty of research to support that. And the most interesting thing about those is that they happen to be fairly high in sodium, right? But when you ingest that, the benefits from all the other plant compounds attenuate and reduce that. So there's no spike whatsoever in blood pressure. So it's one of those rare food items that actually are kind of salty, but you can get away with it because of all the helpful beneficial properties in those fermented products. So great question, actually.
I have a question.
Okay.
I want to know about, I hear sometimes that some people have difficulty with conversion from a plant-based form of something to what is ultimately what we're supposed to have. For example, having beta carotene, that some people have a hard time converting that to vitamin A retinol form. I also hear that with ALA, like chia seeds, flax seeds, converting to the long chain omega-3 fatty acids. Do you have any comment on that?
Not a lot on beta carotene. I don't think that's something that actually those that follow plant-based diets have any risk for. But the ALA question is an interesting one. And I was sort of talking about that earlier, in terms of conversion rates. And again, I go back to the body intelligently designing these pathways. However, just about anywhere in the literature, you'll see this framed as something that's inefficient or not operating correctly. And again, you don't want too much inflammation, and you don't want too much anti-inflammation. You need a really, really nice balance there. And even the original research that looked at fish oil supplements is entirely flawed. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I'll provide you the study that looked, the original study by Bang and Olsen in Greenland, when the Greenland Eskimos were researched, when they went over to Denmark, they were found to have greater coronary heart disease. And they believe that the Greenland diet, which was plentiful in fish and blubber and whale and stuff like that, had some benefit to it, but they were completely off base. I mean, the medical records, for starters, they didn't actually classify them as having heart disease or not. They didn't have the technology in these rural villages to be able to diagnose that they had heart disease. So they just said, you know, expired naturally. So, I mean, it's a fishy tale is what I'll say, and leave it at that. Am I over on time or? Oh, okay, next question. Sure. Yes, go ahead.
Traditional nutrition,
Okay.
which is difficult at times without putting all my information in from plant-based background. But can we revisit the topic of oxalates and phytates?
Okay.
Do they really decrease if I'm eating spinach? Am I getting my calcium?
So the question is oxalates and phytates, which is, or you can add lectins to that, if you will, too, because that's out in the literature. You know, Dr. Gundry really did the public a disfavor by producing that book, which has all been debunked. But when you talk about oxalates and phytates, you know, you're thinking of, is there a risk, an increased risk for kidney stones, right? And the research actually doesn't pan out unless you're eating mother loads of greens. So again, this is where the diversity statement comes in. Most kidney stones actually don't come from dietary sources, and things like dehydration and other medications and things like that actually play a much larger role. So I always, you know, if you look at my garden, I'm not growing all spinach. I'm growing a little spinach, a little kale, you know, a little bit of collards and things like that. So shifting it up is always a good way to ensure you're going to steer away from these potential risks. There probably isn't enough research out there to solidify it, but why not do your microbiome a favor and diversify all the different types of greens? I mean, when you go to the supermarket, how many greens do you bring home? Just anybody have any numbers they're willing to be courageous and share? A few, a handful? A couple? Yeah, I mean, the research suggests that 5 a day is adequate, but 10 a day actually brings the most bang for the buck. So, you know, any way to ramp up as many as you can, fruit and vegetable wise, is going to do yourself a positive favor in the future.
Would that diversity, would it count if we were adding in those concentrated spices that you're talking about, the greens like dill weed and
Oh,
green?
yeah, I don't think they'll qualify, but they're certainly good, you know, in terms of increasing your own consumption. So, I mean, think about it when we were all kids. Who loved vegetables? Who was like, Mom, could you make more cauliflower, you know, and add some Brussels sprouts to it, you know, and look at how far, you know, we knew that back in the 1950s, we didn't have the research, but we had lots of people saying, eat your fruits and vegetables, right? They didn't actually know why. They just knew instinctively, intuitively, that these things are healthy for us. And now we have the research to absolutely prove that every single angle. You know, if you're starting with a patient who wants to transition, maybe just work with adding a new vegetable or a fruit to their diet for a couple weeks and piecemealing it from there rather than going, you know, all the way from one side to the other. But yeah, thank you for that question.
With that, we are out of time. So I would like everybody to give a big round of applause to Tim Radak.
Thank you.